for protesting in Parliament. Donald Trump announces more troop withdrawals from Iraq and Afghanistan. And Queensland and New South Wales battle it out in the State of Origin decider. You're watching The World. Hello, I'm Beverly O'Connor. Also tonight, the return of a radical cleric prompts fears of mass rallies across Indonesia. Well, there was little doubt that China was keeping a close watch on Scott Morrison's visit to Japan, in particular that in-principle agreement to intensify military cooperation. The historic deal would pave the way for Australian and Japanese militaries to have access to each other's bases. Chinese state media has slammed the deal, with a Global Times editorial accusing both countries of acting at the behest of the United States, and is warning that countermeasures are inevitable. And a short time ago, we had official reaction from the Chinese government. The Foreign Ministry in Beijing called on Australia and Japan to stop undermining Chinese sovereignty.
China is strongly dissatisfied and opposed to the unwarranted accusations against China in the statement issued following the leaders' meeting that grossly interfered in China's internal affairs. The countries concerned should have a clear understanding of the situation and stop the wrongdoings that undermine China's sovereignty and interests and interfere in China's internal affairs.
Meantime, China's television networks have been weighing in on developments in Tokyo. Here's how one television host describes relations between Australia and Japan.
Japan's a country that says little and does a lot. Australia is a country that says a lot and does little. These two countries are really well suited to each other.
Quite the analogy. Well, we'll delve deeper into the story with our China correspondent Bill Birtles in just a moment. Well, Hong Kong police have arrested 3 former opposition lawmakers for disrupting legislative meetings in May and June. They've been charged with contempt in the legislature and intent to cause harm to others. Ted Hu, who has been released on bail, condemns what he calls arbitrary arrests. Here's Yvonne Young.
This video released by the Hong Kong Democratic Party appears to show the moment former lawmaker Ted Hui was arrested. A police officer accuses him of splashing smelly liquid on the floor of a conference room in the legislature in June at the 3rd reading of the National Anthem Bill, causing the meeting to be stopped.
I condemn the arbitrary arrest of the police, and I condemn what the regime is doing against us, people with democratic values, people who speak for the core value of Hong Kong.
At the time, pro-democracy activists were protesting the now-approved bill which criminalises any insult or abuse of the Chinese national anthem. This was former lawmaker Ray Chan a week earlier, being carried out of the meeting room. Eddie Chu was dragged out of the chamber too after disrupting the proceedings, also using the smelly liquid tactic. Their placards read, "A murderous regime will stink for 10,000 years." Emergency services were called to the venue, and several pro-Beijing lawmakers reported feeling unwell. Posts on the trio's Facebook account say they've been arrested in relation to these incidents months ago. Eddie Chu and Ray Chan actually quit the legislature in September in protest after Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam postponed elections by a year due to the pandemic. The pro-democracy camp were hoping to win a majority in the vote. But after tumultuous events last week, there's now virtually no opposition voice in the body. Pro-democracy lawmakers resigned en masse over the disqualification of 4 of their members. Their fight to retain the autonomy they say was promised to the city by Beijing is now in limbo. Yvonne Yong, ABC News.
More than 40 people have been injured in Thailand's capital Bangkok after pro-democracy activists tried to storm the parliament. The youth-led protest movement began 4 months ago with calls for constitutional change and reform of the monarchy. In the most violent day so far, they clashed not only with police but with rival supporters of the Thai royal family. Southeast Asia correspondent Mazoe Ford with the story.
Armed with tear gas and water cannon laced with chemicals, Police were determined to stop protesters from entering the grounds of Parliament to demand constitutional change. They warned the young activists not to come within 50 metres, so when they tried to push their way past barbed wire barriers, the police didn't hold back.
Not sure what they used, tear gas or whatever, but when I breathe in, it stings and burns.
Most of the demonstrators were without gas masks, but after rinsing the chemicals away, they returned to their front line with whatever they could use as a shield. As the ugly scenes erupted outside the Parliament, MPs inside were discussing proposals for constitutional change. Most of them won't reform the monarchy, further angering the protesters. After several hours, they did break through the barbed wire. Police retreated, leaving the group to clash with yellow shirt royalist counter-protesters who want the constitution left alone. It was the worst violence for months. More than 40 people were injured, including 5 with gunshot wounds. Police deny using live ammunition.
Many people got injured. Many of them are here at the ambulance. We are just here to call for democracy.
And they won't give up, vowing to continue protesting until things change. Mazoe Ford, ABC News.
Donald Trump will cut US troop numbers in Afghanistan and Iraq just days before President-elect Joe Biden is inaugurated in January. 2,500 soldiers will return home under the drawdown. Senior Republicans have voiced their alarm at the plan, arguing for a more methodical withdrawal. But the Trump administration says it fulfills the president's pledge to put a stop to America's endless wars.
This is consistent with our established plans and strategic objectives, supported by the American people, and does not equate to a change in U.S. policy or objectives.
The consequences of a premature American exit would likely be even worse than President Obama's withdrawal from Iraq back in 2011, which fueled the rise of ISIS and a new round of global terrorism.
US forces have been in Afghanistan for nearly 20 years. And the Australian Defence Chief has briefed NATO partners in Afghanistan ahead of the war crimes inquiry due to be released tomorrow. The findings of the Brereton report into alleged offences committed by Australian Special Forces soldiers is expected to be damning. In the UK, there have been many similar inquiries costing tens of millions of dollars. As Europe correspondent Samantha Hawley reports, they've not delivered a single prosecution.
Iraq, 2003. British troops have detained and hooded their suspects. One, 26-year-old Baha Musa, a hotel receptionist, is wrongly detained and he's later beaten to death.
It was a shocking incident, and I think it brought the British military into terrible shame.
The Iraq Historic Allegations team was tasked with investigating nearly 4,000 claims against British troops. No soldier was ever prosecuted.
So 4,000 members of the armed forces put through years and years and years of absolute hell, careers lost, some of them stripped of their medals.
Another investigation, Operation Northmoor, was launched in 2014 to investigate almost 700 allegations against troops in Afghanistan. $20 million was spent, but it was disbanded this year without a single prosecution. Later, allegations of war crimes were exposed by the BBC's Panorama programme.
If there's a lesson for Australia, or indeed for any other country in the UK's experience, it's that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And the Ministry of Defence have not been forthcoming with a proper investigation.
The British government wants more protection for soldiers against vexatious claims. To try and do that, it's brought a bill before the House of Commons to limit criminal prosecutions to within 5 years of an alleged incident or war crime.
It's a sidestep from international norms, from international law.
The bill has also been criticised by some Conservative MPs who argue atrocities of war can sometimes take many years to come out. Samantha Hawley, ABC News, London.
Well, let's return to our top story with the Chinese government slamming the defence deal between Australia and Japan, warning the leaders to stop undermining China's sovereignty. Our China correspondent Bill Birtles joins us now. Bill, it's pretty clear that China, with this official comment now, is not impressed with this deal signed between Australia and Japan.
Yeah, and Bev, you wouldn't expect them to be. It's a deal that's been in the works for 6 years, so it's not coming as unexpected to Beijing. But the commentary out of China reflects the worldview that Beijing applies to all these things, that all of this is through a US prism, that Australia and Japan are agreeing to this defence pact as part of a broader US containment strategy. And this is why we saw, for example, in state media, China warning that Australia or Japan, or both, were to use this agreement in future in any way that hurt Beijing's interests, then China would inevitably have to come up with countermeasures. Nothing specific, nothing in concrete, but it's the sort of rhetoric you would expect, given that China has been so consistent over the years in framing any sort of cooperation between US allies in the region as part of a US-led push.
Yes, it continues. I mean, some of the commentary around Australia in particular has been quite sort of of a ridiculing nature, and it's going to only further deteriorate relations between our two countries. What is it going to take? We understand there's discussion around what it appears to be a list circulating of what China expects of Australia to try and soothe tensions.
Yeah, well, you can read the tea leaves a bit on this and speculate, but to me it seems like, frankly, there's an increasing desperation on the part of Chinese officials to come up with some sort of tangible gain from what's now been more than 6 months of clear economic coercion attempts. Now, the Chinese government is not really making much effort anymore to try and claim that all those various economic strikes on Australian exports are not related to the bilateral relationship. If anything, what Foreign Ministry spokesperson and now a diplomat in Canberra have been doing is to try and make these demands more explicit. And we've seen a report tonight from 9 newspapers saying that a Chinese diplomat in Canberra, and I think we can all kind of have a guess who, has leaked a dossier, which happens to be a list in English, hardly an internal Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs document when it's in English, has leaked this internal dossier of China's demands for Australia of what would improve the relationship, what Australia must do to improve the relationship. Frankly, Bev, it's all stuff that we've seen before. We're angry about Australia blocking Huawei from the 5G a couple of years ago. We're angry about Australia talking on Taiwan and Hong Kong and so forth. A couple of interesting ones in there. We're angry that the Australian government continues to fund ASPI, the think tank, which in China's view is an anti-China think tank. We're angry about media reports by independent media companies that are anti-China. All these things which we've seen pretty much bubble up year after year. Now it's got to the point where you have Chinese diplomats literally writing it all down and giving it to Australian journalists just to be as clear as possible about what is expected from the Australian side to change. This, to me, Bev, seems to suggest there's a bit of desperation in the ranks of the Foreign Ministry, because for more than 6 months after all these various trade strikes on exports, there isn't much in the way of tangible gains from China. Australia isn't blinking.
And it is interesting too that the big trade deal that was signed over the weekend, that was led by China and agreed to by 15 other regional nations, does offer sanctions and some protection against unfair trade retaliation. So it might be interesting to see down the track whether that gives us leeway to try and counter some of China's sanctions.
Remember, Australia has, for example, a free trade agreement with China, and there are concerns in some of those exporting industries that despite that agreement, these recent strikes against Australian exports, things like arbitrary import bans and so forth, are actually in violation of that chapter agreement. So having an even broader multilateral agreement may not provide protection in these sort of one-on-one direct disputes, but at the very least it might open the door a bit for a bit of dialogue down the track. Certainly not in the meantime, though. The signals coming from both sides, not just from China, from Australia too. I mean, if Scott Morrison goes to Tokyo and signs, or almost signs, an agreement of some sort of defence cooperation, China, of course, is going to see that as highly provocative.
Yeah. And do you think the pact is going to be enough to, to try and warn China about their very assertive push in the region, or do you feel this is just going to be something they are going to continue because they really do believe it is about their sovereignty?
Yeah, well, Chinese analysts today, for example, have described the pact as a step towards an Indo-Pacific anti-China alliance. You've got a situation where China has been rapidly expanding its military budget year on year. It is building, for example, warships at a pace not seen since wartime in the Second World War. This all works very well for a country with 1.4 billion people and the world's second largest economy. You don't need allies. But it's a bit rich to demand that other nations much smaller in the region don't form alliances of any substance. But that's certainly what Beijing expects. It is the tone of China's reaction, saying basically if there's any alliance, it's always aimed at China. That is correct. Of course, it is aimed at China. That's because there's a very big power imbalance between China and its smaller neighbours.
Bill, as always, good to talk. Thanks so much. And in developing news, Queensland has overcome the odds to record a 20-14 win over New South Wales in tonight's State of Origin decider in Brisbane. The Maroons went into the clash as underdogs, although they were on their home turf. The Blues hoping to secure their third series in a win in a row. But after tonight's upset, New South Wales has still only won 2 deciders in Queensland in the past 40 years. So pretty much came out with Queensland dominant on their own patch. At least 9 people have been killed as Hurricane Iota lashes parts of Central America, causing flooding and landslides. Though it's been downgraded to a tropical storm, Iota is wreaking havoc on areas still recovering from Hurricane Eta, which killed more than 130 people and left tens of thousands without shelter. Here's Andrea Nierhoff.
With a roar, Hurricane Iota smashes into Nicaragua's Caribbean coast. The Category 4 storm whipping up waves and dumping rain on already saturated areas along the region, and treating islands like Colombia's Providencia and San Andres like little more than speed bumps in its way.
I was lucky I didn't die. I'm safe now. Don't worry about me because I'm alive.
Though downgraded to a tropical storm, the risk of floods and mudslides remains. Tens of thousands of people were evacuated, but others have been stranded at the border between Nicaragua and Honduras. With electricity and communications cut off, it's impossible to know the extent of the damage.
Hoy todo Honduras está en riesgo.
Today, all of Honduras is at risk. The worst of it is not yet hit. Damage has already begun in different areas across the country.
It's a double whammy, coming 2 weeks after Hurricane Eta swept across Central America, leaving more than 130 people dead and little to no time to recover.
This is a time of year when the season should normally be winding down, and it's not. In fact, we're seeing this sort of very tragic late surge in action. Iota is the strongest storm in the hurricane in the season so far to make landfall.
It is quite clear that this will extend the emergency even into mid-2021.
Iota marks a worrying trend in weather, becoming the 30th named storm in a record season for hurricanes in the Atlantic and the 9th storm to rapidly intensify. It also developed later in the season. The last time that happened was 1932. And there are still 2 weeks left of the official season. Andrea Nierhoff, ABC News.
The US Navy has launched a missile interceptor at sea, destroying a mock intercontinental ballistic missile in flight. The test, conducted in the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, was part of the Pentagon's efforts to develop defences against ICBMs. Previous tests had used interceptors launched from underground silos in the US. Though the move is designed to protect against a missile fired by North Korea, it's likely to be watched closely by China and Russia as well. Well, South Australia is going into a harsh lockdown tonight as a circuit breaker to prevent a second wave. From midnight, businesses will shut, schools will close, and no one can leave home to either walk or even exercise. Health authorities have identified 23 cases linked to the Adelaide cluster, but they are concerned that there may be more undetected.
As a harsh lockdown looms, panic is setting in. Shelves are being stripped bare and long queues are already forming.
There's not much in Coles, it's like more or less empty in there, so I grabbed what I could grab.
I'm all for it if it gets over the pandemic much quicker. I don't want to go through what Victoria went through.
The strict 6-day circuit breaker is a gamble the Premier is hoping will pay off.
We are going hard and we are going early. Time is of the essence and we must act swiftly and decisively. We cannot wait to see how bad this becomes.
Even though only 2 new cases have been detected, authorities are clearly worried. This strain of COVID was brought in by a returned UK traveller on November 2nd. It spreads fast and testing shows it's already in its 5th generation.
It has a very, very short incubation period. That means when somebody gets exposed, it's taking 24 hours or even less for that person to become infectious to others.
That's why from midnight tonight, no one is allowed to leave their homes except for groceries or essential services. Takeaways are closed, exercise outdoors is banned, and masks must be worn in public. Travel is also off limits.
I do not want to be taking this virus or being responsible for taking this virus to other states.
This is the City Medi Hotel where the outbreak began. It's believed a cleaner caught the virus by touching a hard surface and then passed it on to 2 security guards and her family. None of them were ever tested, and one of the guards also worked at a pizza restaurant, infecting at least 1 person. But authorities are defending the Medi Hotel system.
We've never said that this is an airtight, guaranteed scenario. We have guaranteed that we are doing the best we can, and I think we've done that.
Even so, new national regulations are being brought in.
From now, all states and territories have agreed that anyone with quarantine facilities, anyone working in those quarantine facilities will be tested at least weekly.
Extra reinforcements are also coming from interstate to ramp up testing and tracing.
There is no second chance to stop a second wave. We are at a critical point, but we will get through this.
A critical test that no one wants to fail. Richard Davies, ABC News, Adelaide.
Well, let's return to the US, where the Pentagon has announced a reduction of troops in both Afghanistan and Iraq just weeks before President-elect Biden takes office. The move has Afghan officials fearing it will encourage the Taliban to keep fighting. Let's get more with Kate Clark, the co-director of the Afghanistan Analysts Network. She joins us out of London. Kate, good to talk to you. And a very interesting foreign affairs decision just days before Biden takes over. We knew that Trump wanted to further withdraw down troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Is the timing right?
It's horrible. This is a savage cut. It will cut deeply into what the US military can do on the ground, but it will also mean that there will be a withdrawal for other NATO forces, contractors. We could also see some of the civilian staff at embassies thinned down. It's a very quick withdrawal of troops. And there's been concern about what happens to all the stuff in bases, equipment, weaponry, all sorts. Some of it will have to be destroyed because this is too quick a timetable to get it all out. And of course, it leaves the Taliban further with their morale boosted and with the Afghan National Security Forces very much further demoralised. So, from an Afghan point of view, it makes no sense at all.
And there have been such delicate negotiations to try and bring the Taliban to the table, to try and stabilise the situation. Do you think this is just a reckless act by Trump to sort of make a statement on his way out?
Well, it's clearly aimed at the domestic audience at the base. And we've seen time and time again that major policy decisions in Washington are made because of domestic reasons, often fitting in with the American election cycle, that have nothing to do with what's going on in the ground, that are counterproductive. And this is one. The Taliban and the US reached an agreement last February. It was controversial because the Americans gave away a lot to get the Taliban to sign a deal, and they asked very little of the Taliban. So the Taliban basically gave some rather wishy-washy security guarantees, including on groups like Al-Qaeda, and they agreed to talk to the government. On the other side, the Americans agreed to withdraw forces, and this latest withdrawal is actually in addition to what they agreed, and they agreed that the Afghan government would release 5,000 Taliban detainees. So they pushed the Afghan government to release those men. Many of them are back on the battlefield. And now, I think the Afghan government has some grounds for complaint that they were forced to release fighters and commanders back to their homes. And then the US has decided to withdraw troops. So really, the Americans have strengthened the hand of the Taliban and weakened the hand of the Kabul government and the Afghan National Security Forces.
When you look at the situation that has been the most protracted theatre of war for the Americans, little has been gained. Is there any point where it's going to be reasonable for the Americans to withdraw?
Absolutely, and I don't think that's a matter of debate. It's the way it's being done. It's the haste. It's the timing. And it's not just, people in the Afghan government who are concerned. Many civilians are, because what they fear is an intensification of the civil war, that the Taliban now have the upper hand. And indeed, the violence has intensified this year as the peace talks got underway. The Americans are largely out of the war now. They're only taking they're only acting defensively when the Taliban attack the Afghan government security forces. Those forces are largely in defensive mode. It's been the Taliban driving this war, and there's been not only attacks on bases, but also a huge spike in assassinations, targeted killings, kidnappings, really nasty violence against journalists, human rights activists. And we've also had complaints from NATO, from senior Republicans who support Trump. So this has been done very much against the advice, I would say, of American military people and many parts of the American political establishment, as well as America's allies in Afghanistan.
Is it possible that even, if it's just done a few days before he leaves office, that it could be stabilised very quickly once Joe Biden's administration takes over?
Well, I think it's very difficult it would be very difficult for President Biden, as he will then be, to increase the troops, because you've left bases, you've taken out material, or you've destroyed material, so vehicles, weaponry. It then becomes very difficult politically and militarily to re-expand. It's possible, but Joseph Biden has also been someone who has wanted to have a smaller footprint for many years. Since he was vice president, he argued for that very strongly. So, there is a consensus that the war has to end sometime, the deployment has to end sometime. It's the manner in which this is being done, with complete disregard to what it means on the ground, how it strengthens the Taliban, and how, it looks like it will prolong the war, not help to end it.
Kate, appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much. Well, Twitter and Facebook have revealed the extent of efforts to stop misinformation during the American election at an appearance before the US Senate. Twitter placed warning labels on 300,000 tweets in just 2 weeks, but that represented only 0.2% of all election-related posts. Democrats questioned whether enough was being done, and Republican committee members asked if the tech firms should be making those decisions.
More than a year ago, the public asked us to offer additional context to help make potentially misleading information more apparent. We did exactly that.
A law currently protects social media platforms from being sued over content posted by their users. Now to what in the world, and you may remember the viral video about 5 years ago showing a rat in the New York subway dragging a large slice of pizza down a flight of stairs. Well, a performance artist has been going viral in recent weeks by scurrying around New York's subway dressed as a rat. Jonathan Lyons has been filmed doing a number of activities, including bopping to music played by buskers and riding around in the subway cars themselves. He's even promoting COVID safety by wearing a face mask. But a personal favourite is his tribute to Pizza Rat, dragging an oversized slice up a flight of steps while a few innocent commuters try to make their train, only in New York. Our top stories tonight. China warns countermeasures are inevitable after Japan and Australia agree to an historic defence pact. 3 former opposition lawmakers in Hong Kong arrested over their smelly liquid protest tactics months ago. And Queensland has won this year's State of Origin series after a 20-14 win against New South Wales in the decider. Let's return to our top story. And China has reacted angrily to an Australian